There's a specific kind of silence you only find 10 miles offshore, when the engine is cut and the world just stops. It's not the silence of a quiet room or a late-night street. It's heavy. It's a pressurized, ancient sort of silence that feels like it's pressing against your eardrums, reminding you that you're sitting on top of miles of dark, suffocating water. People who don't boat think the ocean is loud, waves crashing, wind howling. But on the right day, the sea can be as still as a sheet of black glass, and that's when you start to hear things you aren't supposed to hear. I grew up on the coast of Maine, a place where the water isn't just a view, it's a way of life. My grandfather was a lobsterman, and my father followed suit, so by the time I was 12, I could navigate a fog bank better than I could ride a bike. There was a comfort in it back then. The smell of diesel fumes mixed with the sharp, cold sting of salt air. The rhythmic times, thwack times of the hull hitting the chop. The camaraderie of the marina where every boat had a name and every name had a story. It felt safe. It felt like home. But the ocean has a way of stripping that comfort away from you, layer by layer, until all that's left is a primal realization of how small you really are. The first time I felt that shift was back in the summer of 2008. I was 24, and I'd finally saved up enough to buy my own rig, a beat-up 30-foot Grady White. I'd christened Times the Mara. She wasn't much to look at, with peeling gel coat and a cabin that smelled perpetually of damp wool, but she was mine. That summer, my younger brother Caleb and I spent every waking moment on that boat. We were chasing bluefin tuna, heading further and further out into the Atlantic, pushing our luck and our fuel gauges. I remember one afternoon in late August. The heat was stifling, a rare, humid weight that seemed to have even silenced the gulls. We had steamed out to a spot we called the Silver Hole, an underwater canyon about 30 miles off the coast. The water there was a deep, bruised purple, so clear you could see 30 feet down into the abyss. Caleb was in the stern, rigging up the heavy tackle, while I sat in the captain's chair, watching the sonar. The screen was dead. Not a single blip, not even a school of mackerel. It was as if the entire ocean had been emptied out. "Quiet out here today, isn't it?" Caleb said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the still air. I nodded, wiping sweat from my forehead. Too quiet. No birds, no bait jumping. Even the swell has died down. I killed the engine to save fuel, and we just drifted. For the first hour, it was peaceful. We cracked a couple of sodas, talked about the upcoming NFL season, and enjoyed the sun. But as the afternoon wore on, that peace started to ferment into something sour. The air felt wrong. It was thick, like it was saturated with something other than water vapor, and the smell changed. Usually, it's all salt and ozone, but a new scent began to waft up from the water, a cloying, metallic smell, like a copper penny held under a tongue. "You smell that?" Caleb asked, pausing with a lure in his hand. He looked over the side, squinting into the depths. "Yeah, probably a dead whale drifting somewhere nearby." I lied. I knew what a dead whale smelled like. This wasn't it. This was sharper. More chemical. That's when the first sound started. It was a rhythmic tapping. Tink, tink, tink. It was coming from the hull, right at the waterline. My first thought was that we drifted into some debris, maybe a piece of floating timber or a discarded lobster pot buoy. I walked over to the rail and looked down. The water was like a mirror, reflecting the pale blue of the hazy sky. There was nothing there. No wood, no rope, no trash. Just the white fiberglass of the hull meeting the dark purple water. Tink, tink, tink. It was steady, methodical, like a finger tapping on a glass window to get someone's attention. "Is that the bilge pump?" Caleb asked, standing up. "No, the pump has a lower hum," I muttered. I walked down into the small cabin, thinking maybe something had come loose in the storage lockers. The sound was louder down there. It echoed off the confined walls, vibrating through the floorboards. But it wasn't coming from the inside. It was definitely coming from the outside, below the waterline. I put my ear against the hull. The fiberglass was cold. Tink, tink, tink. And then it changed. The tapping stopped, replaced by a long, slow scraping sound. It sounded like a heavy grid of sandpaper being dragged along the bottom of the boat, from the bow all the way to the stern. The boat actually shuddered slightly, a tiny vibration that I felt in my teeth. "Sean, get up here!" Caleb's voice was strained. I scrambled back up the companionway. Caleb was leaning over the transom, staring at the water where our lines were submerged. One of the heavy-duty rods was bent double, not with the erratic jerk of a fish, but with a slow, heavy, relentless weight. The reel wasn't screaming. The drag was clicking out one notch at a time. Click, click, click. "Did you snag the bottom?" I asked, though I knew the canyon floor was 1,000 feet below us. "I don't know," he whispered. "It feels heavy, like I'm hooked into a submarine." He reached for the rod, intending to tighten the drag, but he stopped mid-motion. I followed his gaze down into the water, following the line. About 10 feet down, something was visible. It was a pale, amorphous shape, roughly the size of a man, but elongated. It wasn't swimming, it was just there. It stayed perfectly still, suspended in the water, even as the boat drifted. And then, the sound came back. But it wasn't a tap or a scrape. It was a voice. It didn't come from the air. It came from the water. It was muffled, distorted by the medium, like someone trying to speak through a thick wall of gelatin. It sounded like Caleb. "Sean, help. It's cold." My blood turned to ice. I looked at Caleb, who was standing right next to me, his face gone completely white, his hands shaking. He hadn't said a word. His mouth was clamped shut in terror. "Caleb," I breathed. "I didn't say anything," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Sean, I didn't say anything." The voice came again, clearer this time, vibrating through the very deck we were standing on. It didn't just sound like Caleb. It had his exact cadence, his specific way of dragging out the S sounds. "Sean, help. It's so cold down here." The rod Caleb had been holding suddenly snapped. Not the line, the actual carbon fiber rod shattered with a crack like a gunshot. The broken half hissed as it was dragged into the water, disappearing into the purple depths. The pale shape we'd seen beneath the surface didn't dart away. It began to rise, slowly. Inches at a time, the white blur became more defined. It wasn't a fish. It didn't have fins. It looked like a person wrapped in a translucent, milky shroud. There were no features, just the suggestion of a head, shoulders, and long, trailing limbs that moved like seaweed in a current. I didn't wait to see more. I lunged for the keys in the ignition. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped them once, the metal clattering against the deck. I scrambled to pick them up, my eyes locked on the water. The shape was now just 2 feet below the surface. It was reaching out, a pale, spindly limb, ending in what looked like fused fingers, broke the surface of the water without making a single ripple. It touched the side of the boat. The engine roared to life on the third try, coughing out a cloud of blue smoke. I slammed the throttle forward, not even bothering to pull in the other lines. The Maritimes lurched, her bow rising as we accelerated away from the silver hull. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just stared straight ahead at the horizon, praying the engine wouldn't fail, praying that whatever we had seen stayed in the deep where it belonged. Caleb sat on the floor of the cockpit, hugging his knees, staring at the empty rod holder. We didn't talk the whole way back. We didn't talk about it at the dock. We didn't even talk about it years later. We sold the boat 2 weeks after that trip. I told people I needed the money for school. Caleb just said he'd lost his taste for fishing. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed and the house is quiet, I can still hear that rhythmic tapping. Tink, tink, tink. And I wonder, if we hadn't started the engine, if we had waited just one more minute, whose voice would that thing have used next? You think you know the ocean because you've seen the beaches or looked at the maps, but the maps only show the surface. They don't show the things that live in the silence. They don't show the things that have learned how to mimic the people we love just to get us to lean a little closer to the water. But that was just the beginning of my realization that the sea holds more than just secrets. It holds memories. And sometimes, those memories don't want to stay buried. A few years after the incident at the Silver Hole, I found myself working as a deckhand on a private research vessel in the Caribbean. I thought that being around scientists and high-tech equipment would make the water feel solved. I thought that with enough sonar and satellite imagery, the mystery and the fear would evaporate. I was wrong. If anything, the technology only served to highlight the things we couldn't explain. We were stationed off the coast of an uninhabited island chain near the Grenadines. Our job was to map a series of newly discovered hydrothermal vents. It was routine work, launching ROVs, monitoring temperature gradients, collecting soil samples. The crew was professional, the weather was perfect, and for a while, I felt like I had finally moved past the ghosts of the North Atlantic, until we picked up the Echo. It started on a Tuesday night. I was on the bridge with the second mate, a guy named Marcus. The radar swept its green line around the display, over and over. Suddenly, a solid return appeared. Got a vessel, 3 miles out, heading 180, Marcus noted, tapping the screen. I looked out the window with the binoculars. The moon was nearly full, casting a brilliant white path across the Caribbean Sea. I scanned the horizon. Nothing. No navigation lights, no silhouette against the moon. "I don't see anything, Marcus," I said. He frowned, checking the radar again. "That's weird. The return is huge. It's showing something the size of a tanker, but it's moving at 5 knots. And it's... Wait, the blip on the radar didn't just move. It flickered. It was there 1 second, then it was a mile closer the next. Then it was gone. Ghost in the machine? I suggested, though my heart had already started that familiar heavy thumping in my chest. Must be, Marcus said, but he didn't sound convinced. I'll run a diagnostic on the array, but the ghost wasn't just on the radar. About an hour later, the hydrophones, the underwater microphones we used to listen to, the vents, picked up something. It wasn't the bubbling of gas or the shifting of tectonic plates. It was music. It was faint, coming through the speakers in the lab. A slow, brassy swing tune, the kind you'd hear in a ballroom 70 years ago. It was warped, the pitch rising and falling as if the record player was underwater. The lead scientist, Dr. Eris, put on his headphones, his brow furrowed. "Where is that coming from? Is there a cruise ship nearby?" "Radar's clear, Doc," I said, standing in the doorway. He adjusted the dials, trying to clean up the signal. The music grew louder, more distinct. And then, over the sound of the trumpets and the drums, we heard the chatter. Dozens of voices, laughing, clinking glasses, the general hum of a crowded party. It was vibrant and full of life, and it was coming from 3,000 feet below us. "That's impossible," Eris whispered. "Sound doesn't carry like that, and there's nothing down there but volcanic rock and crabs." He redirected the ROV, the remote-operated vehicle, toward the source of the sound. We all gathered around the monitors, watching the live feed. The camera light pierced the eternal darkness of the deep, illuminating the swirling marine snow of organic debris. The sonar on the ROV started chirping. "Object ahead. 50 meters. What is that?" Marcus asked, pointing at the screen. A shape began to emerge from the gloom. It wasn't a rock formation. It was white, polished, metal. As the ROV drifted closer, we saw a row of portholes, then a railing, then a name, etched in elegant gold leaf across a white hull, the Gilded Lily. "It's a yacht," Eris said, his voice trembling. "A classic luxury yacht. It looks brand new." He was right. The boat didn't have a speck of rust. There were no barnacles, no sea growth, no signs of the crushing pressure that should have flattened it like a soda can at this depth. It sat perfectly upright on the sandy bottom, but it was the windows that got us. Behind the glass of the portholes, lights were glowing, a warm, inviting amber glow, and as the ROV's camera panned across the deck, we saw them. Figures. People in tuxedos and evening gowns, standing on the deck, holding champagne flutes. They were perfectly still, like wax figures. They weren't floating, they were standing, as if gravity worked differently for them. Then one of them turned, a woman in a shimmering silver dress. She turned her head toward the ROV's camera. She didn't have a face, just a smooth, featureless surface of pale skin where eyes and a mouth should have been. She raised her glass in a toast, and the speakers in the lab exploded with a sound that wasn't music. It was a scream, a collective, thousand-voice shriek of pure, unadulterated agony that tore through the room. The monitors went black, the hydrophones cut out, the ROV signal was lost. We sat in total silence for a long time. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the hum of the ship's ventilation. "We're leaving, Doctor," Ara said, his voice flat. "Now. We're cutting the cables and we're leaving. We didn't report it. Who would believe us?" We looked up times, the Gilded Lily Times in the Maritime Archives later, a luxury vessel that vanished in 1948 during a calm crossing. No distress signal, no wreckage, just gone. I still think about that woman in the silver dress. I think about the toast she made to a camera that shouldn't have been there, in a place where light shouldn't exist. Was it a haunting, a wrinkle in time, or is the ocean just a giant recording device, playing back the final moments of the lost over and over again? I don't know. All I know is that I don't go out on the water anymore, not even the lakes, because I realize that once you've heard the ocean talk back to you, you never really stop listening for it. I've shared 2 of my stories now. The things I saw, the things I can't explain. But the 3rd story, the one that happened to my father, that's the one that truly keeps me awake at night. Because that's the one that suggests we aren't just being watched, we're being invited. What do you think? Have you ever felt that wrongness on the water? Have you ever heard something through the hull that didn't belong? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Maybe I'm just overthinking it. Maybe it was all just hallucinations brought on by the sun and the salt, but I don't think so. And I don't think you do either. The 3rd story isn't mine. Not entirely. It belongs to my father, a man who spent 40 years on the water and claimed to have seen everything the Atlantic had to throw at him. He was a man of logic, of diesel engines and weather charts. He didn't believe in ghosts, and he certainly didn't believe in feeling things. To him, the ocean was a machine predictable if you knew the mechanics, dangerous only if you were a fool. But there was one trip, back in the late 90s, that changed him. He didn't tell me about it until he was much older, sitting on a porch far away from the coast, nursing a drink and looking at the trees like he was searching for something hidden in the leaves. It was 1998. He was delivering a high-end 50-foot motor yacht from the Virgin Islands up to Charleston. He had a 2-man crew with him, a young guy named Elias and a veteran deckhand named Miller. They were about 3 days out, deep in the Sargasso Sea, a place where the water is so blue it looks like ink, and the wind can die down until the world feels like it's been vacuum sealed. The Sargasso is famous for its stillness, for the mats of golden seaweed that can clog a propeller if you aren't careful. But that night, my father said the stillness was heavy. It wasn't just a lack of wind, it was a lack of times. Everything. No birds, no flying fish jumping in the wake, not even the usual phosphorescence in the water. Just a flat, oily mirror reflecting a moon that looked far too bright. Around 2 a.m., my father was on the bridge. Elias was asleep below, and Miller was supposedly checking the bilge pumps. That's when my father saw the light. It wasn't on the radar. The screen was as clean as a whistle, but there, about half a mile off the port bow, was a steady, warm glow. It looked like the cabin lights of another vessel, but it wasn't flickering or bobbing with the swells. It was perfectly level. He adjusted his course, thinking it might be a boat in distress. As they drew closer, the sea glass, that was the yacht's name, began to vibrate. Not the normal vibration of the twin diesels, but a high-pitched hum that you felt in your teeth. He pulled back on the throttles, bringing the boat to a crawl. Out of the darkness emerged a ship, but it wasn't a modern yacht, and it wasn't a derelict freighter. My father described it as a pleasure palace from the 1920s, a massive, white-hulled steamship with mahogany railings and brass fittings that caught the moonlight like they were made of gold. It was pristine. No rust, no barnacles, no signs of the salt air ever touching it. But there was no engine noise, no wake. It sat on the water like it was part of the surface itself. Miller came up to the bridge then. He didn't say a word. He just stood next to my father, his face pale in the glow of the instrument panel. My father grabbed the binoculars. He looked at the deck of the white ship, and his hand started to shake. He saw people. They were dressed in evening wear tuxedos, shimmering gowns, white gloves. They were standing along the rail, dozens of them, perfectly still. They weren't talking, they weren't drinking. They were all looking directly at the sea glass. My father said their faces were the wrong part. In the moonlight, through the lenses, he could see that they weren't just pale. They looked like they were made of the same white material as the hull. Their features were there, eyes, noses, mouths, but there was no movement, no blinking. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. There was no static, just a voice. It didn't sound like it was coming through the speakers. It sounded like it was coming from inside his own head. "We've been waiting for the sea glass," the voice said. It was melodic, calm, and terrifyingly familiar. My father said it sounded exactly like his own mother, who had passed away 10 years prior. "The water is fine, Arthur. Why don't you come aboard? We have a place set for you." Miller, who was usually a rock of a man, let out a choked sob and backed away from the windows. He whispered, "Don't look at the Marty. Look at the compass." My father looked down. The compass was spinning, not a slow drift, but a violent mechanical whirl, like a fan blade. He looked back at the white ship. One of the figures, a man in a tall hat, raised a hand in a slow, sweeping invitation. As he did, the water between the two boats began to change. It didn't ripple, it began to rise. A smooth, vertical wall of water started to lift upward, silent and impossible, reaching toward the deck of the white ship. It was like the ocean was reaching out to bridge the gap. My father didn't wait. He didn't call Elias. He didn't check the radar again. He slammed the throttles forward. The engines roared, protesting the sudden strain, and the sea glass lurched. But for a second, one long, agonizing second, the boat didn't move. It felt like something had grabbed the keel. The high-pitched humming in his teeth turned into a scream. He told me he closed his eyes and prayed, something he hadn't done since he was a child. He felt a sudden times pop, like a bubble bursting, and the yacht shot forward, nearly throwing Miller off his feet. They didn't look back. They ran those engines at redline for 4 hours, heading due north, away from the coordinates. When the sun finally broke the horizon, they were 50 miles away. Elias woke up that morning and asked why the boat smelled like old flowers and funeral parlors. My father and Miller never answered him. When they reached Charleston, they both quit the delivery business. My father sold his own boat a month later. He told me that story only once. He said the thing that haunted him wasn't the ship, or the people, or even the voice of his mother. It was the fact that for a split second, when the man in the hat waved, he had actually wanted times to go. He felt a pull in his chest, a yearning to jump into that rising wall of water and join them in that silent white world. He told me, "The sea doesn't just take you, son. It asks you first. And if you listen too long, you'll eventually say yes." I think about that every time I'm out past the breakers. I think about the things that might be sitting just out of sight, waiting for the wind to die down and the water to turn to glass. I think about the invitations we haven't heard yet. What do you think? Was it a mass hallucination, a trick of the light in the Sargasso, or is there something out there that builds its own world out of our memories and our dead? I don't go out at night anymore. I stay where the water is shallow, where I can see the bottom, where the world still feels like it belongs to us. But sometimes, when the house is quiet and the wind is just right, I swear I can hear a high-pitched hum in my teeth. And I know the invitation is still open. Stay safe out there. And if you see a light where there shouldn't be one, don't change your course. Just keep your eyes on the compass. Thanks for listening.